Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here for our brown bag workshop on data management. I'm Bonnie Bowen. I'm a recently retired faculty member from Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology. I'm also a co-PI on the SP at ISU program, an NSF-funded program about strengthening the professoriate. And so we're interested in broader impacts and other tools that we can help the faculty and staff with to strengthen your research. And so clearly data management is one of those opportunities. So we want to tell you about some of the things we've been doing. And I'm joined by Megan O'Donnell here, a scholarly communications librarian who joined us just this past fall. And she'll be presenting the second half of the seminar. And I also want to acknowledge that we both worked extensively with Andrea Dinkelman, another librarian who recently left Iowa State, but Andrea was clearly a strong partner in the development of the tools that we're going to talk to you about today. So, data. We all most of us here are either scientists or people who use or generate data in one way or another. What do your data look like? Sort of depends on how long you've been collecting data. You know, I still have, in fact, I'm getting ready to move, and so we're finding all these old disks. So, you know, I actually have some disks that still go in my old K-Pro computer that I still have. You may have data that look like this, that are DNA sequence products. You may have butterflies in a museum case. You may even have samples on a tray. So data come in many different forms, and as scientists we want to, we use our data, and we also want to be able to use our data in the future, and we want for others to be able to use our data. So our goal here today, we have several goals. First, to talk just for a couple minutes about why we should care about data management, and then spend some time with the resources that are available to help researchers with data management and data management planning what you're going to do with all those data. Look some at best practices, and then tools for the development of data management plans, those specific plans that are required by some funding agencies. We'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, look at what resources are specifically available here at Iowa State. This is a partnership, as I said at the beginning, between NSF-funded programs like SP at ISU, Iowa EPSCoR, the University Library, and the Office of the Vice President for Research. So this is a collaborative effort of people that have been interested in this topic that are bringing you this information today. So first, why should we care about data management? Well, the kind of simple answer is the funding agencies are requiring this. Okay, they're requiring a data management plan. NSF is in all proposals. Data sharing is a component of those data management plans, and this is something new to many of us that we'll talk some about today, aspects of data sharing. NIH also has a data sharing policy, so it's not specific to NSF, although a lot of the work we've done has kind of been driven by NSF, but it's going to be applicable to lots of different funding agencies. And in going forward into the future, you're going to be able to use some of the resources we're going to tell you about today to continue to learn more about new requirements as they come up. And of course, NSF awards support a lot of the research that goes on at Iowa State. Not all of it, clearly, but a number of departments in the STEM colleges. So NSF, we care about what NSF wants because we want researchers, to be successful in getting grants. And so that's really kind of what this is about, is helping you be successful in getting grants. So we need to be able to use our data now and into the future. Our scientific findings are built on data. And we are experiencing, obviously, an explosion of information and data. So to use it now and in the future, it needs to be carefully thought about and managed. So those are why we should care about data management. What resources are available to help and assist you in your data management and your data management planning? Well, first you might wonder why the library is involved in this. And of course, librarians and libraries are involved in the management of information, and data is a form of information. So it makes a lot of sense, not only at ISU, but on the national scale, that librarians are very active in the whole question of helping researchers and figuring out best practices for data management. So to that end, as I indicated, I started working a couple years ago with Andrea Dinkelman, and then Megan joined the team. And Megan has developed a library guide for data management. So if you go on the eLibrary website, we're going to talk a lot about this library guide today, you can find the library guide about data management. And it looks something like this. So on the home page, we have just kind of some basic information about funding agency requirements over here, some recommended readings, and then we have some about best practices, what the funding agencies want. But then across right here, this little line here, you're going to see that represented in a number of the slides. That's a bunch of tabs. So this library guide isn't just one page. It's a whole suite of pages that you get to through these different tabs that will lead you to the kind of information we're going to talk about today. So that's a question came up after the last workshop. Well, how do I find that stuff you were talking about? Well, the tabs, they're the key. Okay, so this is the basic information, what our library guide looks like and what's on it. And again, Megan will drill down into some specifics in a few minutes. So what are some best practices for data management? Have these been developed? Well, to some degree, they are discipline specific. So I may say some things right now about best practices, and you may know something about your particular discipline that's a little bit different, and that's fine. Different disciplines do have different practices. If you actually go on the NSF website, you will find different directorates have some guidelines and expectations about data management that are different from other directorates. So there is some discipline specificity. But there are some general principles also. One is to know your data. What do you have? And have you documented what it is, where you got it? Have you kept information about those data? About a year ago, my major professor, remember I just retired, okay, so my major professor, so that was a while back, he wrote to me and he said, you know, I'd really like the data from your dissertation. Ooh. Well, guess what was in a box on the top shelf in the garage, you know? The data from my dissertation. Could I look at those data and know what they were and where they came from? Well, I won't reveal anything here, but let me just say you want to document your data. Keep your data and notes understandable because you may be turning those data over to somebody else. And again, that's not, we'll talk more about data sharing in a minute. And keep the data organized. Keep copies and make backups. And secure your data. Top shelf of the garage, maybe not the best place, the most secure place, but on the other hand, it probably could be worse. And again, you know, this is the data, you know, from a dissertation 30-some years ago, a little bit different than, say, data that might be in electronic format, data that might involve human subjects where security might be particularly important. There might be legal requirements. Again, here are some of the discipline-specific variation about data that you clearly need to be aware of. If you were working on human subjects, the top shelf of the garage probably would not be quite as good. I was working on microteen rodents. People didn't care quite as much about how I secured the data on them. Okay, so let me just, okay, so there's one particular resource I want to point out about best practices, and that is an organization called Data One. It is an NSF-sponsored program that's actually focused on environmental data, but they have a very good website with lots of resources for people who are just getting into this. So there's a primer about data management and best practices about data management. So regardless of the discipline you're in, you may find useful tools. If you just Google Data One, you'll find it. It's, like I say, it's environmentally related. It's based in New Mexico, part of the NEON, kind of related to the NEON program. But a resource really for everybody. Okay, so we have some best practices here, and actually on your handout, we've listed those best practices. You have a little one-page handout there that has the best practices and sort of what the tabs are across that library guide. So okay, we know what's best. Top shelf of the garage, maybe, maybe not. But it can be sometimes difficult to put best practices into practice. Okay, we might be able to make a list, but actually implementing them can be challenging for a researcher. This particularly is true when it comes to data sharing. And again, I've just retired, so I've been collecting data for quite a while, and it's my data. I'm not really into sharing my major professor maybe, but sharing data, that is something that clearly is a newer concept that we might make data widely available for sharing. And again, Megan will talk a little bit more about that. But just to kind of get you thinking about best practices and maybe not so good practices, we have a little video to show you. And you can you have your little list of best practices, and you can kind of think about what it is this researcher maybe didn't do.
Then you might want to click the links on here and check it out. It's a nice storage thing that ISU subscribes to, so all researchers get 50 gigs of storage on the cloud. It's also fairly secure, and it makes backups and does file versioning, so it is definitely something to check out. We also have the short checklist of best practices that you guys saw. There's also a short checklist for recommended data management. And then there's the full checklist, which is really exhaustive. You're not expected to do everything on the full checklist, but it's there for you to consider. We also have lots of links to tools and resources for writing and developing a data management plan. There's links to the NSF. There's a frequently asked question on the NSF page about data management plans you may not have been aware of that there's a link to as well. And of course to the Data One that Bonnie talked about as well is on here as well. So as I said, there's a short and a long data management planning checklist. The short list is really like the bare essentials. It's just like, these are the really basic things you should be thinking about for data management. It's focused on the big picture. It's not going to go on the specifics. If you want the specifics, check out the areas in the full checklist, which has a lot of sections. And so there's short links to each section. And it really asks you to consider in detail where you're putting your data, what your data is, and what you're doing with it. So it will help you develop a comprehensive data management plan, while the brief one is a really good place to start your planning. So the first part of the full checklist, which I call section 0, because this is to help you gather your thoughts. And it probably won't be very exhaustive when you actually write your data management plan, is just to recap what your plan is, who's involved, what the goal is of the project, and what your expected research products are. For example, are you going to be building a database? Is your data stored as images? Is it code or software? Is it text? So just thinking about what you're doing and what you're going to be generating. So section 1, data description and identification, wants you to describe and identify data products of your research. So this is where we start getting more specific. Because your grants are hypothetical, right? If I get the funding, this can be a little tricky. So start thinking about formats, like how do you plan to store it? What programs are you planning to use? What kinds of data is it? Is it experimental? Is it generated by sensors? Are you generating it in the lab based off an experiment you're doing? And how is it being collected? You know, if you're doing an ethnographic survey, really different than doing field notes, for example. So, and you also need to think about the expected size of the data you're going to generate. Is it, going to be megabytes? Is it going to be gigabytes if it's digital? If it's lab notebooks, how many of them do you think you're going to fill? What are you going to do with the lab notebooks afterwards? Will you digitize them? If so, how big is that file going to be? Things to keep in mind. So, section 2, and this cartoon, I have done this. I'm in the middle of revising a paper right now, and our file names are really goofy. And I'm sure everyone can kind of relate to this. Every single time you revise a paper, the name changes, and it doesn't really tell you what's going on. So one of the things you need to think about when you're actually in the process of creating and organizing your data, it's so, like I said, hypothetical, so you have to think ahead. How is it going to be managed, and what are you taking steps to ensure quality? Are there quality checks involved? So file naming and organization systems for one. Coordinate between PIs and graduate students. Make sure everyone's following the same procedure. Quality assurance. Does anyone double check the information that's going in? Does anyone check the revised file to make sure nothing was lost the first, if you updated it, that was important? And file versioning. I mentioned this before because Cybox does file versioning. File versioning is keeping multiple copies of a file and recording the changes and not deleting it or not saving over it every time you make a change. Doesn't mean you have to keep more than 20 copies of a file. You don't need 200. But every time you make a major change, maybe do a save as instead of a save, and have it be numerical or alphabetical so you could track the changes, see what you're doing. So this is how I've had the personal experience with this as well, where someone made a data entry mistake, and we thought it was a disaster, and then we found an older version of the file and was able to restore the mistake, what the mistake had erased. So it's a really good thing to keep in mind, and like I said, you need to train your graduate students in the lab to think about this too if you're working with other people in your lab. So data, documentation, and metadata. So does everyone remember, the Snowden NSA? Everyone was talking about metadata back then, a few months ago. Still a little bit. Metadata is, in short, data about data. It describes your data. So, for example, SAM1, not a very descriptive name for your data, right? It doesn't mean anything. A better name for that would have been what the researcher told the other researcher. I think it was it was a protein name. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head. So provide descriptive information. This may not all fit in the spreadsheet. So instead, you can make an abbreviation, record that abbreviation and what it means somewhere else. Just make sure it's documented. So metadata is important because it makes it usable, not just by other people, but also by you. So 20 years later, for example, I may not remember what my field name really means because it's been a long time since I opened that file, since I did the research. But if I have it documented somewhere, it tells me why I chose that name, what it means, maybe the methods used to generate the data. Suddenly that data is not only understandable to me, it's understandable to other people who can use it too. So metadata is a work in progress for many fields. Some fields, like geosciences, have fairly standardized metadata. That's because the government organized it and they have big repositories. For a lot of other fields, this is still a work in progress. So I encourage you to either check with your colleagues, see if they have a scheme that you think will work good for yours and maybe, tweak it so it works for you. Check out some of the other ones that have already been developed. There are links on the guide. Or if none of them fit, do the best you can. And that's what a lot of experiments have to do. Just do the best you can. So data storage, backup, and security. So locations, you need to think both physical and digital. If it's in my office, who has access to my office? Do I have an open door policy? Can anyone just walk in? Is the file password protected? Is the computer password protected? Maybe the server's in a basement? Is the basement prone to flooding? Not a good thing, right? So security is not just about like that you have backup copies and it's like secure from disaster, which is another thing you should probably think about. It's also just like who has access to it. If you have human research subjects, of course, this is of much more concern than some other data. But there's also been cases where like endangered species location data has not been released because they don't want people to go and hunt them or track them down. So think about, before you release it too, for data sharing, what are the potential impacts? That's for security as well. So data sharing, this is the big question. How do we share our data? So there are a couple of different ways you can do this. First thing you need to figure out, though, is the legality. Can you share it, or is there an ethics conflict? Like I said, it's not just necessarily human research subjects. It can also be like locations of animals, artifact information, things of potential value. You also need to think about how others will find, locate, and access the data. If it's on a USB drive in a box, not only can you not easily access the data, other people don't even know it exists, and they don't know where it is, and they have to use you as a gatekeeper to get that data. So that means data sharing is complicated if you keep it somewhere like that. If you put it somewhere in a public repository, and we'll talk about repositories in a bit, the burden of being a gatekeeper to your own data is lifted, and it's automatic. Your data gets harvested by search engines, people can find it, people can reuse it, hopefully with the right documentation they can understand it. So other things you should think about is how long it should be available. Is it long-term data? If it's weather patterns, that's considered long-term data. It's of use over 100 years later, for example. If it's something that's maybe not quite maybe it's an experimental machine that, and it's never went into production, maybe it doesn't need to be kept for 100 years or more. So, and like I said, repositories, that's something we'll get to. So the last thing is data preservation. Preservation is not storing data. Storing data is just where you put it, like what medium it's in and where it's physically located. Preservation is an active process, and so I use the American Heritage Dictionary definition here. It's to maintain in safety. It's like to prevent harm and injury. It is also to keep, perfect or unaltered or unchanged, but also at least for the library and librarians and archivists, we also think about it being accessible, keeping it accessible too. So it is a complex and ongoing commitment, and I will just admit all the right tools have not been developed yet, but there are places that are doing better than others, and I would encourage you to check them out. So you also don't need to preserve all of your data. Choose which ones have the most value or maybe are the most understandable. So like, for example, you don't need to put all your versions up there, just maybe the most final and complete version. So you also think about who will have custody of it, and by that I mean you're entrusting it to someone long term. So when you sign a contract for a research paper, you're usually entrusting the publisher to keep that accessible, right? Same thing with data. It's a product. It's a research product. You need to entrust it to someone that will make sure it's preserved and shared correctly, right? So think about, who will have custody, long-term value, and where you want it to go for data preservation. So I said we're going to talk about repositories. So this is the section on repositories. We have a tab, Data and Text Repositories, on the guide. Excuse my silly little screenshot. There are two kinds of repositories right now. There's data repositories and there's text repositories. ISU right now only has a text repository. It's the institutional repository called Digital Repository at Iowa State University. We put research articles and other text products in there. Data repositories, on the other hand, ISU doesn't have one yet. So I encourage you to look at other ones that are at national levels to consider storing your data. There's Dryad, GenBake, ICPSR, Treebase, Dataverse. Some of these are well known depending on the field. Some of these are also, for example, tree-based is only systematics data, I believe. So it depends on what types of data you have and who your expected audience is will determine where you want to put it. So we have some tools for finding a data repository as well on the guide. And I'm going to use Dryad as an example of a data repository. This is a piece of data on Dryad that's been shared over 2,000 times when I grabbed the screenshot. This is one of the most popular sets on there. And it has a lot of attachments. It's not just one piece of data, it's multiple pieces of data because it's packaged with instructions for citation, metadata, and also Dryad is taking care of preservation. The researchers entrusted Dryad with their data. So Dryad also assigns a DOI, which is a digital object identifier. You often see those on journal articles now. It's a unique number. It's like a serial number for a digital object. So that means it's easier to cite and track down as well. So Dryad does charge a small fee when you deposit data. It's under $100 per data set. And while they started as ecological and biology-based data repository, they encourage all data now to go in, regardless of discipline. So you may want to check them out. We also have a frequently asked questions page that has targeted answers for specific topics. So if other parts of the guide aren't answering your question, you may want to check out this page. You also should probably, if you really can't figure anything out that's on the guide, or if it's not making sense, doesn't answer your question, please feel free to contact me as well. My information's on there. I have actually done data management plan consultations with a couple of researchers since the first presentation. And I'm happy to assist you with that as much as I can. I will say I cannot promise your grant will be funded through the data management plan consultation because the guidelines are very vague. But I can help you interpret them and apply them to your project. So what ISU resources are available? So we do have links to the ITS policies and standards. As I said, we have the digital repository at Iowa State University, which is our open access repository, which has mostly text. It can be used to fulfill open access mandates for articles, but not data. There are data storage services on campus as well. I mentioned SciBox earlier. There's a link on the guide. I would really suggest checking it out. I linked to the ITS page about it. I've been using it for my research because you can also have other people at other institutions have accounts. And it's easy to share files with them as well if you're collaborating. So there's also, of course, sci files and org files, which I think most people are familiar with as well. And the different policies for archiving retention and stuff depend on what your organization has set up, for org files. It can be variable. So that's it. And like I said, if you have any questions or something on the guide doesn't make sense, please don't hesitate to contact me. I meant to actually say this earlier. So it's actually a lot easier to find the guide now. If you go to the library website, we have the site index. And if you click D, it's the first link in the D section on the library website. I think we have a link on the handout I gave you as well. So if you go to the library website, if you click D, it's really easy to find. So.